Hello, friends. Welcome to the Case for Life program. Delighted to have you with us today. I want to remind you of something. If you have not had an opportunity to check out our course, Pro-Life 101, I encourage you to do that. We've got information for you on the screen about where you can get that. It will equip you to defend life and sift through a lot of pro-abortion rhetoric like what we're going to look at today. Yesterday, an article came out in the Washington Monthly, an article that is written by someone who's no friend of the pro-life movement, and she has written a piece about the architects of those who dismantled Roe v. Wade. She wants to get to the bottom of who the players were, and she is going to go through her reasons why she thinks abortion rights have been rolled back. And what you're going to notice here is not one of the reasons she gives actually refutes the pro-life argument. And I'm going to take time today to talk about this because I am just continually bothered by pro-lifers who accept the premises of our opponents without pushing back on them and keeping the main thing the main thing. I have said repeatedly on this show that if you don't stick to your pro-life syllogism like glue, you're going to get led down rabbit trails that have nothing to do with the rightness or wrongness of abortion. And today is no exception, as we're going to look at an article that appeared, as I said, in the Washington Monthly. This article resonates with the American public. So it's vitally important that we know how to point out to people who are fooled by this kind of stuff why this kind of reasoning doesn't work. All right, the article is entitled, "Who Killed Roe v. Wade?" And again, it appeared on April 6th of this year, so just a little over a week ago. And I just saw it yesterday. I misspoke a moment ago when I said it came out yesterday. I saw it yesterday. It's entitled, "Roe's Autopsy: The Death of Roe v. Wade, How It Followed Decades of Premeditation." And she goes through the players she thinks were responsible for the downfall of Roe. And we're not going to get into the names she gets into because it's really not a point here that we need to worry about. Here's her first thing she says, basically. She says, "Now we live in a new reality of Dobbs and have for almost 4 years. Its devastating impact is becoming clearer every day." So what's that devastating impact? Here she says, "At least 7 women have died and thousands have been forced to give birth against their will, despite being victims of rape, incest, and domestic violence." Okay, lots to unpack there. That's just a loaded poisoning the well statement that's not really an argument, but let's go ahead and take it apart a little bit. She says at least 7 women have died. Okay, before we go into the factual reality here, which is that these women that died actually died in most cases because pro-abortionists made it easy for medical practitioners to dispense drugs to women without proper medical supervision, and some of them died as the result of that. That's a tragedy, but that's not on the pro-life movement. We can also point out that there is a factual problem with doctors in some states not knowing the law. That's not on the pro-life movement. That's on doctors that should know better. But that's really not the main thing we want to focus on first. We want to focus first on what this objection is assuming. Now, this is kind of just a rehash of the old back alley argument that says, if you restrict abortion, women are going to die by the boatloads in back alleys securing illegal abortions at the hands of practitioners who are not trained to do the procedure safely. We've all heard this argument. Sometimes it goes by the coat hanger argument, back alley argument, call it whatever you want. The argument is essentially the same, that pro-life laws kill women. That's the claim. Okay, so let's start with a basic starting point here that goes like this. What does this argument assume about the unborn? And the answer is, it assumes they're not human. Well, how do we know that? Well, why should the law be faulted for making it more risky for one human to intentionally kill another completely innocent human being? Unless you assume the unborn aren't human, that's what you're arguing. You're saying some humans should have the right to kill other intentionally simply because they're in the way or because we think it's safer for us. That argument only works if you assume that your victim is not a human being. I mean, you can think about this. What if somebody said, hey, I feel that toddlers put parents at risk. Therefore, what we ought to do is make it safe and legal for parents to kill toddlers. Now, let's say there was a society somewhere where that was in fact the case, where kids were, let's say, contracting a disease, an illness that was unique to kids, except that kids could give it to their parents and their parents might die. Would we argue then the answer to that is to go kill all those toddlers so that their parents aren't at risk? No, we would argue that you can't have a right to intentionally kill another innocent human being simply because it will make it safer for you. That doesn't work. So notice the assumption here, the unborn aren't human. Now then she throws in the typical rape objection. Okay, we've talked about this before, but the question is this: is it okay to intentionally kill an innocent human being so that we can feel better? How should a civil society treat innocent human beings that remind us of something painful? This objection also assumes the unborn aren't human because nobody says you can kill a 2-year-old who reminds a mother of a painful event. Suppose a woman has a 4-year-old, and this child, every time she looks at the child, it reminds her of what her boyfriend or husband did to her that brought about the conception of this child. And let's say that every time she looks at this child, she remembers being sexually assaulted by that ex-boyfriend. Would that justify killing the 4-year-old? The answer is no, because hardship does not justify homicide. And by the way, can I just point out that when the author throws rape in here, she really isn't believing her own argument. She's using that to try to poison the well. And let me show how you can call her bluff. If I were sitting across from her at a table and she made this statement to me, I would say, let me ask you something. Suppose I agree that abortion should be legal for rape. Will you now join me in opposing all other abortions that have nothing to do with rape? Well, we already know her answer because here's what she says. Thousands of women have been forced to give birth against their will. In other words, her real position is that a woman should have a fundamental right to an abortion, a statement she'll make in just a minute. We'll get to that. Her real position is there should be no restrictions on abortion because it's a fundamental right. So why is she hiding behind rape victims? Well, because she's trying to let rhetoric use rhetoric to advance her argument rather than logical reasons. So you see this happening. She then goes on to say this, and this is a very interesting thing to me. She says the Dobbs decision, quote, ended half a century of American women having the basic and fundamental right to control their reproductive lives. The result has been a civil and human rights nightmare. Okay, let's do something here that I want you to learn to do. Ask questions to force people to define their terms. Notice what she says. It is denied, the Dobbs decision, she says, has denied American women basic and fundamental rights to reproductive health care. Okay, I'm going to stop right there and I'm going to ask her, what do you mean by a fundamental right? And where did that right come from? Now, the reason why this is an important question is because you cannot pluck rights out of thin air. People on the left love to do this, whether they're talking about alleged transgender rights, gay marriage rights, abortion rights. They love to invent rights out of thin air. I don't let them get away with it. I'm going to ask the question, what do you mean by a fundamental right? And where did this right come from? Now, here's the key thing to keep in mind. If a right is fundamental, It is a right that someone has prior to government. Fundamental, or what we call natural rights, are rights you have as a human being that do not depend on the government to grant them. Government's job is to recognize and protect those rights, not grant them. So I'm going to ask this person very firmly, gently but firmly, where does this fundamental right that you speak of come from? And she needs to answer that question. If it comes from the government, if that's what she says, well, Roe v. Wade gave women that fundamental right. Rights come from the government. That's all we need. Well, if that's true, the same government that grants a right to an abortion can, of course, do what? Take it away. So I need to know a better foundation for this alleged right to an abortion than just, hey, well, Roe v. Wade granted it. Well, a court that grants a right to an abortion can take it away, which makes it interesting why she's complaining that Dobbs did away with Roe. If rights strictly come from the government and the government changes its mind, to what do you appeal with your grievance that that right to an abortion is no longer there? Now, they might get clever at this point and go ahead and say, well, rights come from a transcendent source. Okay, well, wait a minute now. We are not talking then about a government right. And by the way, I agree that our fundamental rights do come from a transcendent source. That's precisely what we see in the Declaration of Independence. It's precisely what we see in the views of the Founding Fathers. And it is that view of transcendent human rights that allowed this nation to get rid of slavery, although it took 100 years, regrettably. It allowed us to recognize that women and children had rights that we ought to respect. That's a good thing that rights come from a transcendent source. But what's going to get interesting here is in a moment she's going to claim that all opposition to abortion is grounded in religious extremism. But wait a minute, if our secular marketplace of ideas must be expunged of everything religious, then how are you going to ground a transcendent right to an abortion that is prior to the state? You're going to have great difficulty doing this. And in fact, in her article here, that again appeared in the Washington Monthly on April 6th, entitled "Who Killed Roe v. Wade?" the author does nothing to provide a transcendent grounding point for an alleged right to an abortion. She just asserts it, does nothing to try to establish a real foundation for it. Now, the next thing she's going to do is identify for us who the culprits are, who, as she says, committed this crime of getting rid of Roe v. Wade. Now, that's an interesting claim, a crime. It seems to me that the reversal of Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the two decisions that were propping up this alleged right to an abortion, it seems to me it was a democratic process that got rid of that. Well, how do we know that? Well, the country held an election in 2016. That country elected a Republican majority in the Senate and a Republican president. The Republican president appointed justices to replace retiring liberal justices. That's in our Constitution. The president has that ability to appoint justices. The Senate, also following the rules of the Constitution, approved the president's nominees for the Supreme Court. So we ended up with 3 new justices on the Supreme Court who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade because, listen, they felt it was bad law. Now, here's what's interesting. The Supreme Court did not rule on the question it kicked down the street and, just kicked the can down the street on the question of, are the unborn members of the human family? I wish it had, but it did not. Instead, the court was just answering the narrow question, is there a right to an abortion in the Constitution? And the court came to the correct conclusion that no, there is not. The reasoning that had been used by the prior court, the Blackmun Court in 1973, to invent this right to an abortion, the current Supreme Court said that reasoning was vacuous, it was inadequate, and there is no right to an abortion. And typically what the left would say is, well, we know for a fact historically that Roe v. Wade corrected history on abortion in this country, because Roe v. Wade said that anti-abortion laws that were originated in the 1860s were only there to protect women, not the unborn. Women were being subjected to dangerous surgical procedures, and so politicians voted to ban the procedure to protect women. But that's simply not true. If you look at the history, even pro-abortion historians like James Moore and others have pointed out that the laws restricting abortion were aimed at protecting the unborn. The physicians' crusade against abortion in the 1860s, feminists in the 19th century coalesced around this idea that abortion was a crime, that it was the worst kind of child abuse imaginable, and they rallied to get politicians to recognize abortion as being a crime against humanity. That's what drove the laws against abortion prior to Roe v. Wade that the court struck down on grounds that, well, they weren't really there to protect the unborn, just women from dangerous abortions. And since abortion is no longer dangerous, we don't need laws protecting the unborn anymore because they weren't the target of those laws anyway. Well, that's bad history, and that's just one of the points the court took up, and it struck down Roe because there was no constitutional basis for an alleged right to an abortion. Now, the author of this piece does nothing to refute the logic of the Dobbs decision. She nowhere says, let me show you where they got their history wrong. Let me show you where there is, in fact, in the Constitution, a right to an abortion. She does no such thing. She goes on to then point to the people who were responsible for getting rid of this alleged right to an abortion. She calls them criminals, essentially. And here's what she says. Not surprisingly, the tribe that did this, notice that loaded language, tribe, is made up mostly of white, male, religious extremists whose Catholic or Christian evangelical faith gives them the staunch conviction that abortion is cold-blooded murder. Notice she doesn't even entertain for a second that we might have an argument for our view. She just labels it and dismisses it. She calls it religious extremism and just gets rid of it with a slap of the back of the hand. That's it. That's the extent she goes to try to engage the pro-life argument. Now, this is a classic example of what we call the genetic fallacy. Whenever you hear somebody say, I'm going to give you the motivations for why somebody believes the way they do, and boy, once you understand that, you'll realize they are a complete nut job. Okay, that's a fallacious way of arguing known as the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy, false ideas based on their origins rather than the merits of the argument itself. So look at this. She says, here's the origins of the pro-life argument she's arguing here. She says it's made up from people who are mostly white, male, and they're religious extremists. That's who made up the pro-life argument. All right, you know what? I'm going to grant that's true. It's not, but let's go ahead and grant it. It's true. Everyone who is pro-life and influential in our movement is male, white, a religious extremist, okay? Let's make it even worse. They beat their wives and children. They're the worst people in the world. Let's say they hate women too. How would that refute the pro-life argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings? Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. Could that argument still be a good one, even if the people advancing it are terrible? And of course, the answer is yes. And again, what we find in the literature of our day is a very dumbed down form of reasoning that majors in poisoning the well and minors, if at all, in actually engaging the pro-life argument. Now, I read through this entire piece, and nowhere does she engage the pro-life argument, the syllogism we've taught you that I just reviewed a moment ago. They do nothing to engage that argument. They just do the attacks personally. Yeah, hey, he's a male, he has religion, That's why he opposes abortion. All right, maybe I am a male. Maybe I am religious. How does that refute my argument? And the obvious answer is it does not. Now, she goes on to do something else that is kind of a, if you will, almost a backhanded compliment to pro-life laws. She goes on to decry the 1976 Hyde Amendment, which what that did is, in 1976, the Hyde Amendment, which was introduced in Congress, cut off federal Medicaid funding for abortion procedures. It was introduced by a congressman at the time known as Henry Hyde from Illinois, and Hyde, being a staunch pro-lifer, managed to get through Congress a bill that got renewed every legislative session that said you cannot use federal tax money to fund abortion procedures through Medicare. That piece of legislation, notice what the author says. The Hyde Amendment, which banned Medicaid funding for abortion, is the anti-abortion movement's first victory. And she goes on to decry that piece of legislation stopped thousands of women from being able to exercise their alleged fundamental right to an abortion. Now, you right away ought to be thinking, wait a minute, she just said something that I doubt she really wanted to say. And that is this: isn't she implicitly conceding that pro-life laws work? And the answer is yes. I mean, what do we hear from pro-abortionists all the time? Well, the law won't do any good deterring abortion. You can't pass laws. It's going to happen anyway. Women are just going to go to the back alleys of America and have abortions. Don't think about passing laws. In fact, even some people who are pro-life Christians make this argument. They shouldn't, but they do because they've heard it from pro-abortionists and they've absorbed it. And the fallacious idea here is that laws do nothing to curb behavior. Well, here's a pro-abortion author who just implicitly said the laws work, because she's complaining that the Hyde Amendment, which made it illegal to use funding from the federal government to pay for abortions, actually did stop women from having abortions. She's complaining about it because the law worked. So that actually works against her view. And I could go on with this article, but I'll just tell you it's very indicative of what we're hearing, especially now as we start gearing up for the midterms. You're going to hear more and more about hateful pro-lifers who don't care about women who've been raped, who don't care about women dying, who want women to die, and who are driven by religious extremism. Now, on that question of religious extremism, I want to give you a tactic for responding when that claim is leveled against you, and I'll take that up right after the break. Stay with us. We'll get to that question. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Hello, friends. We've been talking about an article that appeared in the Washington Monthly that says opposition to abortion is driven by white, male, religious extremists. And I mentioned that we need to ask people to define their terms. So if I were sitting across the table from this author and she said, the people who oppose abortion are religious, political extremists, I would ask her this question: what do you mean by a religious political extremist? Well, we know because she told us in the article, these are people who think they're right. And what drives them to think they're right is their religious political extremism. But I would nonetheless ask her this question: what do you mean by religious political extremist? And her answer would be, well, people who are arrogant and claim to be right, who think they have the truth and nobody else does. My next question to her, I'll bet you can guess what it would be. Do you think you're right about your position on abortion? Why, of course. Every rational person would think like I do, would be her answer. And then I would politely say, so let me see if I understand this right. If I claim to be right, I'm a religious political extremist. But if you claim to be right, you're just right. Is that fair? I mean, that's what's going on here. Her own argument is committing suicide. She is decrying people who claim to be right, but she claims she is right, right? Yeah, obviously. So asking that question, what do you mean by religious political extremist, can expose how she's doing the very thing she is accusing her opponents of doing, and that is claiming to be right. Now, another related thing here that she does not address, but it is a similar argument, is the claim that, oh, you're pro-life, you think abortion is murder? Are you willing to put women in prison and maybe execute them for murder? Now, I'm going to suggest that you do two things. First, go back to your syllogism. It's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. Did we use the word murder in that syllogism? The answer is no. And by the way, that's intentional, because I think when you use the word murder, you distract people from abortion. And here's why. They're going to think, well, abortion isn't murder in a lot of states, and even the Supreme Court hasn't said it's murder. Now you've got to defend your claim that abortion is murder. I don't want to have to do extra work. I'm just going to argue that it unjustly kills an innocent human being. That is hard for them to refute. Puts me in the driver's seat rather than defending more stuff. But secondly, I'm going to again ask this question. Let's say I'm inconsistent. I am unwilling to prosecute women consistently for having an abortion the way I would if they killed, say, their toddlers or their teenagers. Let's say I'm inconsistent. How does that refute my pro-life argument that abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being? And the answer is, of course, it doesn't. All it does is prove that you are personally inconsistent in applying your ethic. It does not refute your pro-life argument. Friends, I've said over and over again on this show, and quite frankly, I'll never stop saying it, less is more. Stick to your pro-life syllogism. Keep the main thing, and you will stay in control of these conversations. Look forward to seeing you next time on the Case for Life program. Thank you for joining us.